Welcome to HomeWord. I'm Jim Burns, and it's going to be a great podcast today. I just want to tell you that. You know, in recent years, our world has seen a pandemic of depression and anxiety and really despair in kids and teenagers. I mean, in fact, the age group that has seen the highest increase in suicide rates, you know what it is? It's kids ages 10 to 14. A lot of our listeners and watchers on the YouTube channel have kids who are 10 to 14. And I don't want to hurt your heart because we're going to give you some hope. But hey, the combination of social media and social unrest, uncertainty, sexual confusion, isolation, I mean, just to name a few of the issues, has kids experiencing anger and fear and pain and hurt at epidemic proportions. Well, parents, teachers, youth pastors, and anyone else who deals with kids are saying the world has changed and it's not always for the better. I mean, I was a youth pastor a long time ago. I remember when we didn't deal with these issues to the extent we do now. Well, today we're going to give you some hope, like I said, and we're going to give you some skills as well to help hurting kids. My guest today, and I'm so pleased to have her, is Dr. Chinwé Williams, and we are talking about leveraging the power of connection with your kids. And we're going to do it especially kids who are experiencing some degree of despair and depression and anxiety, and kind of which kid is not doing that these days. I mean, a lot of them at different levels. Chinwé is a trauma therapist. She's a best-selling author and she's a speaker. And yet I saw this in her bio. Her favorite role is being a wife and a mom to 3 awesome kids. And what a joy to just to even get to know her and talk to her before the podcast began. She's the co-author of a wonderful book, among other books, but the co-author of a wonderful book called Seen, Healing Despair and Anxiety in Kids and Teens Through the Power of Connection. By the way, it is a great book. I read it this week. If you have a kid who is struggling with frankly, any kind of trauma, this is an excellent resource for you. But if you have a kid who's not struggling with trauma, it's still an excellent book. You'll see this as we talk. Chinwé, it's an honor to speak to you, and welcome to the podcast today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Jim. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And remember that all things Chinwé Williams are on our podcast notes. And also, I just went to her website today. It's drchinwaywilliams.com. And it's really, really a good resource and a great, a very, very good place to get to know all Chinwé. Yeah, I know you get. We're going to get to the word hope, but I know you get this a lot. But you know, it's tough out there right now. I mean, suicide is up, depression, anxiety continues to rise. The pandemic didn't help that. But why are so many kids today so depressed and anxious?
Yeah, so the world has changed. You
Yeah.
mentioned being a youth pastor, starting off as a youth pastor. I started my career as a school counselor. I worked in the high schools, and this was probably 18 years ago when I started. And I saw depression. I saw kids struggling with anxiety. I supported kids who were dealing with some tough things at home. But I've got to tell you, Jim, what I'm seeing now in my private practice, in my conversations with parents, educators, ministry leaders, I think back to what I was seeing then, what I saw then, pales in comparison
Yeah.
to what I'm seeing now. And
Yeah.
the world has changed. We're living in a time, we're living in a season where people are desperate to be seen. And I think the youngest generation, even with the advent of the selfies and the connection, the hyper connection to social media, they are still desperate to be seen. I would imagine that chances are anyone who's listening right now knows someone who is struggling with anxiety, depression, even self-harm. And if you are among the older generation like Jim and I, you might be scratching your heads, right? Thinking, how in the world did we get here? You're wondering that. But if you have a young person listening to this conversation right now, they're probably telling you, like the teenagers that I counsel tell me, I don't remember a time where I wasn't seeing this among my friend groups, right?
Right.
Or maybe even experiencing some of this myself. So when you ask the question, why the rise? That's the question every parent, every grandparent, every teacher is asking. And it's complicated and simple all at the same time, but three things really stand out from my research and from the work that I've been doing the last few years. And the first is just pressure. I think young people have been experiencing extraordinary pressure, the pressure to be okay, the pressure to be perfect. Sometimes when you see things on social media, and we'll get to social media in just a minute, we automatically as adults think that kids are getting sort of negative messages and bad things. But sometimes, even when kids are seeing good things or what we would deem positive things, they're still feeling pressure. And I'll tell you, I live in North Fulton, and North Fulton has been cited as having some of the highest suicide rates in the state of Georgia, and part
Yes.
of it certainly in the Atlanta area. And let me tell you, North Fulton is a very well resourced area with families who love their kids, families who take their kids to church, families who have financial resources, and kids of all walks of life are struggling. So I think that the bar has shifted. Kids want to be good not just at one thing; they want to be excellent at
Right.
everything. That's a lot of pressure for kids. That's a lot of pressure for us as adults, and the pressure to succeed, I think, is it feels more heightened. It's heavier for kids in ways that previous generations just didn't
No,
experience.
I,
So,
I I think you're right. There was you were talking about the Fulton area
mhm,
in Atlanta area, but the suicide belt that they used to call the big suicide place was also a place called Lake Forest, Illinois.
mm,
High capacity income, kids who were feeling all kinds of pressure. And there was a season in my life where I would speak at those kinds of things, or if there was some kind of a thing at Columbine, I was there. They would bring me out,
mhm, mhm.
and so I thought I saw despair and anxiety. Nothing
Yeah.
like what you just said. It's
Yeah.
like, and I love in your book seeing how you talk about that. But you also used a word, and it's a word that I don't use a lot, and yet I thought you explained it so well. You said many kids feel despair, and
Yes.
and I want you to talk about despair, but
Mhm.
also how the brain affects what the Bible calls the dark night of the soul, because that's kind of despair. And you write about that. Talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. So despair is defined as a deep sadness, so a deep hopelessness
Mm,
or the complete loss or absence of hope, right?
yeah,
So that's hopelessness. So hopelessness and social disconnection is a dangerous combination for kids and teens. So
mm,
when you are suffering or when you are going through something in deep despair, you feel like you're suffering without any meaning. So, again, that's a really, really tough place to be. So, when the brain is experiencing high levels of anxiety, so anxiety is normal. We all experience anxiety. Sadness is normal, right? To be sad, to be anxious, that just means that you're human. But if you're experiencing those things to such a high degree, over time, from a neurological perspective, it's almost like two parts of the brain, the left hemisphere of the brain, which is sort of the logical processing side, and then the
mm,
right side of the brain, which is more of your sensory processing and emotions. And this is where really big emotions live, such as fear, such as experiences of trauma and fright. So those two hemispheres of the brain, and this is according to neuroscience, it's almost like there's a despairing that
yeah,
happens where one side isn't communicating with the other side. So, this is sort of my simplified explanation. So, cortisol is coursing through the body, and that's just not sustainable. So,
yeah,
when a child is experiencing, again, long bouts of anxiety, long bouts of despair, depression, not feeling seen, that takes a toll on the brain. And that actually, what I want to mention to your listeners is the fear or the threat doesn't have to be real. It could
yeah,
actually be
yeah,
perceived. So it could be driving on a major highway and having a car pull out in front of you. And you're like, oh my gosh, something's going to happen. I'm not going to make it. I'm going to die. I'm going to crash. Cortisol is coursing through your body. But then that sort of goes away. But for a teenager, for example, I started my career working with teenagers. Sometimes the threat is perceived. The threat is about not feeling included or feeling actively excluded. And so, if that is happening for a long period of time and a child or a teenager isn't talking about it, imagine the cortisol not necessarily coursing, but it's like a slow drip, 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 and it's still stress. So, your brain gets hijacked. The logical part of your brain isn't able to really make sense of this, right? When you have high emotional arousal on the right side of the brain, the logical part of the brain decreases. You're not accessing good information to make good decisions. So we call that disconnection. So that despairing is a disconnect between the left and the right side of the brain. And if you ask any child, any teenager, any adult, about this feeling of disconnection, they will tell you that this is one of the hardest places to be. And if you push a little bit and say, "How are you feeling?" They may say, "I feel nothing." And you push a little bit more because you're a caring adult and you love them and you want to help. And you say, "No, tell me really, how are you feeling?" They may say, "I feel numb." And part of that is that it's hard to put words to those types of emotions, right? Because the logical processing has really
I mean,
gone
that's so
down.
good. What I hear you saying, by the way, I'm a brain nerd, and you just described it better than anybody I've ever heard. It was so good. But this emotional numbness and what you use the word emotional numb,
Yes.
emotional detachment.
Yes.
What's interesting about it is we as parents sometimes make the mistake of going, "Oh, just feel better. Just pull, you're going to be okay."
Mhm.
When in fact, what they need is what you claim is that
Mhm.
is they need to be seen and to be
Yes.
understood. And sometimes that's not just you're going to get better. It's going to be okay. Life's not as bad as you're acting. That's not helping our kids sometimes from a parent view, even though you kind of know. I mean, as a parent, you have experience that the kids don't have, so they are trusting that cortisol, stuff going on in their head more than they're trusting their parents.
Yes, yes, that's so true.
But the numbness is really interesting. It's interesting that you said it that
Mhm.
way. I really
Mhm.
appreciate that.
Mhm.
So, the question we all are asking is, how do you help kids feel seen?
Yes.
And again, every kid isn't numb, emotionally numb. But the
Mhm.
interesting side to it is when you're talking about this, crisis is self-perceived. So I
Yes.
have said this for years, but I could have somebody die in my life, and another person could have acne on their face as a teenager, and they're going to the prom and they feel terrible. That's a crisis to them
Yeah.
because it's always self-perceived.
Yes.
And we need to help them feel seen. And I just thought in this book, and I think it just absolutely rocks. You had 5 excellent ways to feel seen, and
Yeah.
I'm actually going to go through them. Show up, see them, just listen, speak life, and build grit. My goal in life is to get through this entire podcast and actually go through all 5 of them, which I never get through, but I'm going to do it this time. And I want you to start by just talking about show up. I mean, show up
Yeah.
when they're hurting, show up when they're not hurting. I call this the power of being there. What do you mean by show up?
Oh, that's so good. I love it. So, the tendency for most caregivers, most parents, most caring adults, teachers, ministry leaders, is to show up when kids are hurting.
Yep.
Whatever the case may be, maybe it's the ups and downs of adolescence, maybe it's a 2 year old having a meltdown. We're drawn, when our kids are struggling, we're drawn to try to figure it out and help them. But we're also drawn to show up during those big, monumental milestone moments in their lives. Um, and that's awesome. I was a high school counselor. When I showed up for the football games, when I showed up for the lacrosse games and basketball, my students will come back to me on Monday and say, "I saw you." And they really want to see their parents. They want to see their grandparents when they're graduating, when they're at that recital. But Jim, what I've noticed in my work and also in my research is that kids want us to show up when it's not convenient. For us, kids want us to show up not just in those big milestone moments, but also in the mundane moments,
Yeah.
because especially as teenagers, they're sort of testing us. And because most of my work has been with adolescents, I'll tell you that parents will start to pull away during adolescence for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a great relationship, but maybe
Right.
the kids are driving. Now they're working, they're spending more
Right.
time naturally with peers. They're pulling away from the family a little bit.
Yeah, they're moving from dependence on their parents to independence.
That's the stage of life that's
Yeah, right.
really focused on independence. So, what I tell parents all the time, because sometimes there is some friction in the relationship. Yes, they're going to pull you away for a number of reasons, but we have to look for ways to be present with them because you
Yeah,
know this at 15 and 16, they're making really big life decisions.
right.
They're being faced with all sorts of things on social media. Thank you, algorithm. Um,
Right.
at
Right.
school and making choices about their lives and their careers. So I really encourage parents to first, let me just say, as a working parent, parents are busier than ever, and they are doing the best that they possibly can. I think parents are working harder now than maybe they ever have, and our schedules get really hectic. But we should never ever forget to spend quality time with our
Yeah,
kids at
yeah,
any developmental stage or
yeah.
phase.
One of the things I really appreciated when you say that is because we do need quality time,
Mhm.
but sometimes we just need quantity time. I mean,
Yes.
I remember with my daughter, I have 3 daughters, so, no hormones or drama, of course, in our life ever. But when they were in their teenage years, even younger, the good conversations a lot of times didn't happen if I was trying to do knee to knee, face to face. The good conversations happened when I'd say, "Hey, do you want to go get a bagel? Do you want to go get," I'll tell
Yes.
my wife this, "ice cream? Let's go get a donut." I was the dad who, taught them to eat sugar. Um, but you know what? All of a sudden, out of the clear blue, we would have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so, presence matters. I hear you saying that. And
Yes.
sometimes when they're teens, they're going to go, "Not now, mom.
Mhm,
Not now,
mhm.
dad." But we just have to understand that they're not rejecting us at that moment.
Yes.
And
It's
and they'll come back around. So I really appreciate that. I want to throw out one more and then we'll take a quick break.
yeah.
See them. Kids are asking
Yes.
questions. Do you see me? Of course we see them.
Yes. Yes.
Kids are being seen more than any other time because they're on social media, but
Yes.
they don't feel like they're being seen.
No, they
See me.
don't. They don't. And let me share very quickly my little soapbox sort of sentiment. I try not to act like a teacher or a lecturer or a professor, but in this case,
Mhm.
I may come across that way. I believe one of the biggest ways that we as parents and caring adults fail to see our kids is when we ignore, dismiss, or disregard those big emotions that,
Right,
especially around adolescence, can feel off putting and even disrespectful.
right,
So,
right.
seeing them at whatever age or phase of development really does require us to look beyond how they're behaving on the outside, especially as a trauma therapist. And Dr. Jim, you know this too. They're behaving, right? And we're seeing those behaviors. But if we can look beyond what they're showing us on the outside to try to understand what they might be feeling on the inside, that's a game changer.
No, it
Um,
is good.
yeah.
Really good.
Yes.
And as you're saying that, I mean, I had a kid one time, I was talking to this kid, I go, "What is going on with you?" Because they're asking the girl. And he goes, and it was about a certain issue that he was, just ballistic on. And
Mhm.
he said, "Well, my dad doesn't come to my games."
Mm.
That didn't have anything to do in my mind with what the presenting issue was. Oh, it had everything to do with it because he was finally just kind of acting out that he was frustrated that his dad put the work ahead of, going to a game. And so we have to remember that. I love that. Listen, we're going to take a quick break.
Mhm.
Um, so good today. We're talking about leveraging the power of connection with your kids. We're talking about a book called Seen, which is, by the way, just a great book that Chinwé wrote with Will Hutchinson. And I love the book. I know a lot of people where this has been their kind of Bible to help kids think through some of this stuff. Great conversation, like I said. By the way, all information, I've said this before, on our podcast show notes. You can learn all about Chinwé and you can see why you want to learn about her. And also you can find out how to get a copy of that book as well. We'll be right back.
I'm Erin Mashaw, and I want to invite you into an honest conversation about one of life's most awkward yet important topics, sex.
Conversations about sex can bring up all kinds of weird emotions, not the least of which is awkward. But that's not a reason to avoid the topic altogether.
So, if everybody's doing it, then what's the big deal?
Where do you go with your questions? There are lots of voices telling you who you are, how to dress, what to think, how to feel. So how do we know what to listen to? Who can we trust to guide us?
When we treat others with radical respect, we honor God. We make our lives and relationships better, and we reflect God's love to the world all around us.
Now, I know you might be thinking, what? I don't need guardrails. I have good intentions, but what if intention isn't enough?
And as you think about the path from where you are now to where you want to be, who are the friends that can help you get there?
You'll hear personal stories, helpful advice, and truth from the Bible about how to make wise choices when it comes to love, sex, and dating.
Imagine being able to look back on this stage of your life without regrets about the way you handled relationships. You're not going to get there by accident. You're going to have to decide in advance what guardrails to put in place to get to where you want to be.
Join us for a student's guide to sexual integrity.
Welcome back. What a great podcast today. Chinwé, as we talk about how to help kids struggling with really any kind of trauma. I mean, we're focusing on things like depression and anxiety, but kind of any kind of trauma, and kids have trauma. You say just listen. I always say listening is the language of love. But in your mind, listening really helps them feel seen.
Yes.
What do you mean?
Yes. So listening is powerful. It seems too simple to matter because we have ears and we're listening all the time, but hearing is not the same as listening. So for someone who is in deep despair, having high anxiety, maybe they didn't go through a trauma, maybe they don't have a mental health condition, but they're struggling. It's really hard to formulate words to express the emotion that you're feeling. It's actually very difficult. It takes time and a feeling of safety. So parents, caregivers, leaders can actually provide that safety that allows kids to open up if we do one big thing, which is forget about teaching. And I'm a teacher. So I have to remind myself with my own kids, right? Forget about saying the right thing. I'm one that wants to offer support. So we learn this in counseling, as you know, that listening is so powerful. Too often, what gets in the way is trying to figure out what we're going to say next. Instead, as parents, we want to focus on what your child or your teenager has to say. And by the way, your presence is way more important than your words. Way
Absolutely.
more. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny because I know this, and then I'll be talking with one of my own children, and I'm a fix-it guy.
Yes.
So, and especially if they feel a little depressed or feeling a little anxious or whatever, I want to make that go away.
Yeah.
So sometimes I hurt the situation by saying, well, let me just tell you, here's 3 points in a poem and you're going to be fine. Instead of just listening. I had an experience once where when I was a youth pastor, I had a young woman come into my office and she just sat down and she just blurted out everything. And she was telling me about a boyfriend situation and it wasn't good. And she was going through all this. And I asked maybe 2 questions about it. And then she looked at her watch and she goes, "Oh, I got to go. You are amazing. Thank you so much." But I'm like, I didn't say anything actually. And I just chuckled because all she needed to do was just kind of get it out. By the time she was done talking to me,
Yeah.
she actually had figured out what the issue was herself. Now, that's easy when you're sitting in a room with somebody who's like, you as a counselor,
Yes.
back in my days. But with my own kids, it's so hard. And, now I have a book on doing life with your adult children. And I often say unsolicited advice is taken as criticism.
That's
so
right.
I want to give advice and I'm right most of the time.
You are.
My wife always says, you all. But I'll say something to my kids, and my wife will go, "You need to practice your principle number 2 because you just gave unsolicited advice." They took it as criticism instead of like the truth. And so sometimes we have to let them figure it out themselves, but be a sounding block. I love that. We could talk all day on that one. So we've got show up, see them, just listen. And then this might be one of my favorites, speak life. So you've listened. I was the area director for Young Life when I was going to Princeton in grad school. And what we always used to say was, earn the right to be heard, but then you do speak, but we sometimes speak way too fast or too quick into the deal. But talk about speaking life into them.
Yes, absolutely. So when we just listen, we help our kids to emotionally exhale. So that's sort of the takeaway. After that emotional exhale, so remember they just need to get it out. So that'll help parents to realize that they don't have to teach. They don't have to have the perfect words. Kids need to get it out. After they emotionally exhale, then it's really important to speak life. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the world. Our kids are being bombarded by lots of messages about who they are, who they aren't, what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, right? And we talked about the factors that are contributing to high anxiety, depression, and despair.
Yeah.
It's pressure to succeed, it's loneliness, and it's also social media. Technology isn't all bad, but it plays a role, and that's where our kids are getting a lot of these messages. Sometimes they're getting it at school through bullying or just kids
Mhm.
sort of, being kids. But if your child is a sensitive child, they're going to, experience that random comment in a very harsh way. So what we have to do, because of the barrage of critical voices and messages that our kids hear every single day that's echoing around our culture, it's vital for parents and other caring adults to constantly speak affirming, life giving words to
Right.
kids at every phase of life. So, neuroscience tells us, you know this, Dr. Jim, we have about 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day, roughly,
Right.
depending on what research study you're looking at. 80% of those thoughts are negative. And so those really negative self appraisals are starting young. I get parents of 6 year olds
Mm.
calling me, I'm not going to say every week, but multiple times per quarter,
Yeah. Right.
saying, my child is saying these terrible things about
Yeah.
themselves and they're not getting it from us. So, a child, we have to combat that, right? A child needs to hear
Right.
many more positive
Right.
comments to
Sure.
counteract the negative ones.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. I mean, so many times what I hear, well, Mark Twain said it best. I can live 2 months on one good compliment. You know,
Yes.
and as a parent, we have to be their biggest cheerleader. I have a
Yes.
friend named Tony who used to be one of the great speakers. He's now kind of aged out a little bit, but he used to say, "Whoever pays attention to kids and affirms them owns them."
Mm.
And I thought that was really interesting because he was talking about gangs, frankly,
Mhm.
and how sometimes a gang, if they're trying to get somebody to come into a gang, it's not like they're doing it by negativity. They're doing it by positivity. They're doing it with
Yes.
affirmation. Um, and and people are drawn to affirmation. So we've got to be those cheerleaders. We have to speak into it. You talked about challenging their negative thoughts. And I thought you and Will did a great job with kind of a cool acronym. I like acronyms.
I
Maybe
do
I'm an old
too.
guy on that. Oh, an old guy. You put me and you in the same level. Anybody who's on our podcast, on the HomeWord YouTube channel, they're going, wait, she just put Jim old and her old. It's not even close. So, but anyway, thank you so much. See, that was an affirmation. You made my day, and I can now live another day. But the acronym is THINK, and it's
Yes.
is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? I love that. I don't think it just works for kids. I think it works for adults too. So how do you use those questions to help a kid make better choices than just think, negative thoughts?
Yeah, so you've worked and you support folks in youth ministry, and so you know this very well. We like handles. Teachers like handles. Youth ministers like handles. Things that are easy, simple, sort of go-to reminders. This is probably the thing that gets printed out the most and laminated when we speak at churches. Think,
That's good.
and the reason why is because our thoughts and our emotions are and our behaviors are linked. So the way that we think impacts how we feel, it impacts how we interact with the people that we love. So we all will have unhelpful thoughts from time to time, but it's important to know what to do with them when they appear,
Yeah.
because if they linger and start to we start to ruminate on them, that's really one of the main causes of both depression and anxiety. So we don't want our negative thoughts to change the course of our day. So it's
Yeah.
important to change the negative thoughts. And so when I'm talking to my teenagers, if I say, oh, instead of saying that I'm a piece of, whatever crap, I hope I can say that. If I can't, I'm
Crap,
sorry.
crap is okay
I
on
work
the home podcast.
I live with adolescents in the counseling office. You don't have to say, I'm the best athlete in the world.
Yeah.
I'm the smartest. I'm a genius. I'm
Yeah.
gorgeous.
Right.
You can just say something neutral. I'm trying really hard. I'm doing the best I can. Or maybe I didn't do my very best, but tomorrow is a new day, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that, and I'll even do it exercise. How does that feel? Instead of saying that you are garbage, how does it feel to say that you're trying your very best,
Yeah.
right? And so the key strategies, I think is just so easy, but really what we're talking about is identifying those negative thoughts, understand how it
Yeah.
makes you feel, the impact it has on your emotions and then your behaviors, Is it helpful? What's the purpose? Is it serving you? How does it make you feel? And then replace it with something that's more realistic.
Yeah, no, so good. And even the Bible says, as a person thinks in their heart, so are they. I mean, that's a King
Yes.
James version of it. But Emerson said, what a person thinks about all day, they become. So when you're saying they have so many negative thoughts, that they're becoming those negative thoughts if they're not careful. So one loving adult can make a difference in a kid's life by helping to affirm them and help them to kind of change the way that they think on those negative things. Really, really, really good. I told you I was going to try to get through all of them, and I am. Your last suggestion to help kids feel seen was to build grit. I love the word grit. I don't know why I love that. It was an old movie by John Wayne, which I remember as a kid. So me as a kid watching, called True Grit. It has nothing to do with the word grit, maybe, but I love what it means now. But Angela Duckworth, one of the most often TED Talks that anybody ever watches,
Yes.
wrote a book on grit. But talk to us what you mean by how do they feel seen by building grit?
Yeah. So shout out to Angela Duckworth. So
Yeah.
the way that
Good.
she and the way that Will and I talk about grit in the book is having a passion for something and being able to persevere toward that passion, that goal, that thing that you want to accomplish despite obstacles. And isn't life full of trouble? That's what it says in the Bible, right? In
good.
this life, you will have trouble.
Right.
So we want to not shield our kids from trouble because that's part of life. And actually, being able to go through adversity, figure out the lessons that you need to learn through adversity helps to build resilience. So grit is one of those tough, amazing. It comes
Yeah.
from from the athletic world. It comes from Dr. Duckworth. It's another word for resilience. So the goal of every single tool that you mentioned today, Jim, is to help your child to overcome life's inevitable obstacles and help them to build self-discipline, self-regulation, and resilience. I was going to say self-management, but resilience.
No, it's so good. And as parents, sometimes we are enabling our kids and not helping them learn grit. And so they become adults and they are entitled or they have a failure to launch because they don't know how to live with some grit. I love that word. I noticed that you were at WindShape, which is one of my favorite, conference center in America.
Love them.
And last time I spoke there, and I think I'm going to be there next month, but the last time I spoke there, I spoke on marital grit. Because it sounds so unromantic. As soon as I started talking about marital grit, I go, oh, this is not romantic.
People start to dissociate.
later, I was talking on, how to rekindle your sex life.
Yes.
And yet, in this one, I'm talking about grit, persevere. It sounded so unromantic, but the truth of the matter is that, good marriages have grit.
That's
And
exactly right.
kids need to learn how to have grit, and it'll actually help them in every aspect of their life. So I love this. I can't believe our time's up. I have a new favorite, Chinwé. Honestly, I say this on the podcast sometimes where I go, oh, I love this show. I loved our conversation today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, so good. And remember, all things Chinwé Williams you can find in our podcast notes, and go to her website, drchinwewilliams.com. It's super. Hey, before we sign off, let me give you some great thoughts in review from actually the book we've just been talking about called Seen. I'm kind of really into this right now. And so this is from their book. This is not me, but I love this content. I think this is the first time on the podcast I've not used my content instead of somebody else's, but this is too good. When we show up, they feel loved. When we see them, they feel understood. Just listen and they feel safe. Remember I said listening is the language of love. Speak life and they feel worthy, and develop grit in their life and they're going to feel empowered. So such a great conversation today. And my thanks to Chinwé Williams, to Mike Segovia, our producer, Jack Spear running the camera here for the podcast, HomeWord YouTube podcast, and especially just to you for listening today. If it's been helpful, let us know. If you listen on the Apple Podcast platform, we're on all the platforms, but leave a review there. And until next time, I'm Jim Burns, and you've been listening to HomeWord. Thanks for listening.